much,
Thank you,
Hunter.
Hunter. Thank you. Thank you so much. Amazing, amazing intro to Pam. Let's go.
I know. I
Pam,
feel like I don't have to say anything now. Thank you, Hunter. Appreciate
like
that.
literally, but I'm going to make you say a little bit more because we have to give you more and more. We have to flex. You're here to flex a little bit. Like, we are so excited, first and foremost, Pam, for you to be here. Thank you so much for kicking off and being part of Power to Fly's DEIB Business Solutions Summit. And we are very, very excited to hear from you regarding what you want to share about measuring DEIB and using data to drive that result. So first and foremost, I want you to give us a little bit more about you, a little bit more about how did you get into this field and why you decided to create your own nonprofit, as well as telling us why both public accountability as well as data transparency are needed when it comes to DEIB.
Thanks, Lucy. So Hunter gave kind of like the career background. So I'll talk more about kind of how I got into DEI specifically. So in my last corporate role, which I left in 2019 and I started there in 2016, I was really involved in our DEI efforts, both on sitting on our company's diversity council. I started the Asian Business Resource Group there, and so had like an insider's view into what companies were doing, and starting in around 2016, of what solutions looked like, what discussions looked like around DEI. And what I found is, well intended as everyone was, as everything we were working on was important for the community, and it felt good because we did a lot of events, we did a lot of panels. None of it was long-term and sustainable. None of it was oriented around changing the infrastructure of the company, the systems and the processes within it that actually dictate the inequities and the lack of inclusion, the lack of diversity that we're talking about. I'm not saying that ERGs or community events aren't important for culture and for kind of the overall morale of the company. But what I found was there was a lack of connection with what we were doing to any executive, I was about to say executive orders, and I was like, we're not talking about the White House, but kind of executive level planning in terms of business strategy, annual objectives. Like, nothing was tied, everything we were doing wasn't tied to something larger. And so at that time, I think starting to see that, I was like, okay, how are we going to start to work on like the internal bones, right? The infrastructure that needs to change. And different ways of trying like didn't quite pan out because the senior leadership wasn't bought into that approach. They were more like, we're already doing all this stuff, this is great. And so I was like, okay, until we're getting senior management and senior leadership in the C-suite to think about this as a business strategy problem, it wasn't going to ever focus on the long-term change that I thought was needed. So when I left and I went into coaching, I was like, okay, I'm just gonna work with talent. I'm gonna help empower like talent to make more sustainable choices for their career.
Right.
But I think for 2020, like a lot of us, especially, coming into June and then George Floyd's murder, I think there was this moment in June and July where a lot of people were just like, what can we do beyond protesting and donations and petitions? And within each circle of power that we occupy, and I think this is true whether you are in the first year of your career or whether you're on the 30th year of your career in the C-suite, there is a space that we occupy in which we can kind of change the conversation, right? At least with the community of people that we interact with, whether it's even your friend groups outside of work. And so I started to think about, okay, what's the circle of power that I occupy that I could start to influence? And I'd been in the marketing and advertising industry for so long, so I started there because a lot of companies in that world started to share data around their workforce, around seniority, around gender, around race, except where I was seeing it was in like social media, on random websites, in like a blog post here or in an article. And so I was like, well, this is going to be disaggregated. Once this moment passes and once the PR moment passes, this is all going to get lost in the ether of the internet. So agency DEI, I'll just touch on that really quickly. The initial thought was just, let's centralize this data, let's standardize this data because everybody shared in different formats. So how can we kind of put it all in one place so that people can look at this in the future, and how can we track progress year over year? So I'll say that to answer kind of the first part of the question of how I got into DEI and a little bit about agency DEI, but I'll speak to public accountability and data transparency. So if we go back to 1964, that's when the Civil Rights Act was passed. That's when the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was started. That's when the EEO-1, which is the EEOC's form that every company has to submit every year with their HR data, started. That form hasn't changed much at all, except for maybe one thing like 20 years ago. So in 60 years, that form has barely changed. But the EEOC clearly found value in collecting data. And all of us, whether you work at a business or a nonprofit, we know how important data is to measure what we're producing, right?
Right.
The results and the
Exactly.
value of what we're producing. So we widely accept that data is necessary for all kind of business measurement. This is no different, right? And so it's kind of like working off very foundational principles. And for one thing I'll say in terms of public accountability, and why data transparency in the public sphere is, I'll just talk about the advertising industry as an example. Since 1964, there have been diversity programs, there have been junior talent training programs, there have been recruitment programs, there have been, university like connections to get diverse talent into various industries and various companies. That's since the 1960s and probably even prior to that. The conversation that we were having in 2020 wouldn't have been the same conversation as what we were talking about 60, 70 years ago if pipeline hiring, recruiting, training programs focused on diverse talent has been working. And I'm not saying that the efforts of those groups haven't been worthwhile, because they are. It's more that it's a disservice to those groups and all of those programs that there hasn't been structural change once people enter these organizations. And so if we could trust that all leaders and organizations were focused on structural changes within their companies, we wouldn't necessarily need public accountability. But oftentimes public accountability comes into play when we're kind of like, okay, we've given you the space to do it on your own. You haven't done it, despite lawsuits, despite various measures from the government, from advocacy groups to change the conversation. Then it's like, okay, then we need something in the public sphere that people feel accountable to, that we can then track and actually measure progress year over year. So
Right.
I know I just said a lot, so I'll pause there.
No. You were saying a lot and you were dropping a lot of knowledge. And so this is amazing, which we already have a question, but I wanted to get into another question and then try to tie that in. Oh, and we got another one too. I love this. So then what can the DEIB data tell us then?
Yeah. So I think I can start to maybe touch on what Eleanor is asking, because I haven't read Julie's question yet. So Eleanor's question is asking about, is what we're doing working? What we're doing is clearly a long-term solve, right? Because the problem is we don't really have a lot of data going back many years. There are some companies, especially publicly traded companies, that have started to share the EEO-1s that they submit to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and we might have a few years of data on that. We're going to start tracking the Fortune 100 this year. We started in the advertising industry as a test to make sure that this was useful, that we found traction, people found value from it. And so we're going to start tracking the Fortune 100 this year. So we'll probably have a few years worth of data. The reason why we wanted to start with data is because DEIB is such a complicated topic that we were like, let's use the data to figure out where we specifically need to focus. And so one thing that I can point to, and our thesis based off the data of the last 2 years, so I think, to a degree, it's starting to work. Our thesis is centered around the idea that we want to reframe the DEI conversation around progression, because so much of it is focused on recruiting and hiring. If we can refocus it on progression, which includes hiring and getting people in the door, and if we focus on why are people not progressing through your organization, and we can look at various identity groups that are dropping off in representation, and we were seeing this at every non-dominant group, with every non-dominant group, for women, for every non-white racial group, the drop-off is pretty steep from the professional level as an individual contributor to the first management level, and then increasingly more so from the management to senior executive to the C-suite. And so if we can address the fact that it is basically like an inverse curve, right? So for men and women, men go up, women go down. For the white population and for every other racial group, the white population goes up and the other populations go down. And so if we can start to talk about structurally what's happening within organizations to move people along the organization, to make sure that they have equal opportunity to progress, then we can maybe focus on more of the nuances of like, here's where DEIB needs to focus. Because inclusion and belonging is so important in any place that we're in, but people don't work because they want to feel included. First and foremost, right? We work because we want to get paid. We work because we have, bills to pay. We have mouths to feed. And so if people feel like they can progress in an organization, that means that you see people in leadership that not just look like you, but understand your experience. And so if we have more diverse representation at every level of leadership, then the discussion around inclusion and belonging becomes a lot more dynamic because you have individuals in those seats already. And the last thing I'll say about that is diverse representation in a moment does not equate to sustained representation. And so
I'm sorry, we gotta we're going to church. We're going to church on Thursday. We're going to church on a Thursday. Can I hear that again? Because I actually, that's really, can you please say that again?
Yes, absolutely. I need a billboard for this.
Okay.
So diverse representation in a moment does not equate to sustained representation over time, right? And that has been the issue. It's like, oh, we've got like a Black C-suite leader. We've got an Asian, C-suite leader over here. I'm like, but that doesn't mean that it'll keep being the case if the structural changes don't happen. Of course, there are individuals that have gotten to those seats.
Right.
But like we've had those people in those seats in the 60s and the 70s, though far fewer than now.
Right.
How can we make sure that companies are focused on ensuring that the structure and processes and the business operations within their companies support that, even if those leaders leave, right? Even if the diversity champions leave. Because right now, diversity leaders are moving or basically playing musical chairs, right? So the minute someone leaves, what does that do for the DEI program within that company? And so the more that it's integrated into business strategy, the more that it's integrated into strategic planning, and the more that it's treated as a talent development problem and a progression problem, we believe that's the starting point for far more structural change. And so that's what the data showed us. We were able to point to something more specific and nuanced to have companies to look at. And the discussions that we're having with companies are shifting less around how do we get more, blank people in the door,
right,
to how do we actually look at what's happening within our organization to see where people are dropping off.
I love that. Oh my gosh, this is just so amazing. So Julie asked, and forgive me, working on reading out loud well. So Julie asked, can you comment on diversity data globally? We have the ability to track a certain amount of it for US-based candidates and employees, but we're a global company. We're a global company that that data is much important outside of the US. I think we got the gist of that, but thank you for letting me read that out loud.
Yeah, of course. So it's an imperfect answer, but I think it goes back to where we think DEI problems exist, and I think it exists locally, right? And so it exists locally within an organization, and it exists locally within the context of the culture that impacts the issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging within the region in which that office sits. And so we were very intentionally started with just US and Canada data, because even including Mexico and the North America pool, would it make sense because the racial dynamics, the gender dynamics, the societal issues within those environments are totally different. And so we've been asked this question quite a few times from companies who are like, can you collect global data? And we're like, we would love to, but we don't have the subject matter expertise, right? I wouldn't want to speak for what's happening in EMEA and Asia Pacific,
right,
of what those dynamics are and what around inequity and around the lack of inclusion and the lack of diversity.
How hard is it to hold that off though, and not just want to create, you know what I mean? For you all, that's gotta be, but that's the truth right now. So you're living in that truth of being like, hey, we don't have that yet, and here's the reason why, because that that explanation makes sense. I'm sorry, Pam, continue.
No, no, no. I mean, you're just putting the exclamation point on that point. We would love to, but I think at the same time, and I think this is like the strategy background in me, where I'm like,
Yeah,
okay, we have to come up with a sound beginning, right? And I
right,
probably
right.
take too much time on the beginning than like, the tactical execution. The last thing we wanted to was to jump into anything and invalidate, basically kind of lose our integrity in the process, right? Because so my two co-founders, Amanda Wu and Joe Hayes, are kind of the data queens behind this whole project. And we talked a lot about like, do we create benchmarks? Do we create a scorecard? And ultimately, even within the US and Canada, we were like, there's no way for us to validate whether a company is doing well or not without being inside those walls, right? Without doing a really extensive audit. And so that's why we didn't go any kind of ranking or ratings approach. We were like, let's just show the data. People can see, we'll point to certain things that we're seeing in terms of data analysis, but we didn't want to jump the gun and say, here's the best company to work at, right? Or here's the most
Right.
inclusive place, because ultimately that's a really hard thing to judge. I mean, like look at all the Glassdoor's reviews, right? There's really great reviews and there's really negative reviews. And so
Exactly.
we might move towards that in the future if we feel like we can come up with a sound methodology to evaluate that. But as a starting point, I think just showing people, here's what the broad population looks like at a company you're considering. Here's what progression looks like. Here's what representation at each level looks like. We're also collecting retention data and attrition data. So that's another thing that we're looking to collect more of, so we can point to why certain groups are staying much longer in certain positions than others, right? Why certain groups are leaving at a faster rate than others. So I'll pause there.
No, no, no. So I would say, so it's that where is that where companies should begin if they're interested in workforce data transparency, or is there more to it? Like, um, am I making sense with that question?
I
Like,
mean,
where do companies begin if they are interested in workforce data transparency? Like, is
yeah.
that where they should be starting? Are those examples that you just gave?
Yeah. So so what we're also trying to create is a data standard around diversity workforce
Okay.
diversity data,
Okay. Okay.
because we've looked at the EEOCs, and like I said, it hasn't changed in about 60 years, right? And so it's pretty outdated in terms of how it classifies workers. It doesn't ask for a lot of detail in terms of leveling. It asks for senior level, and that's kind of it. It doesn't really speak to retention and attrition. It doesn't break it down by kind of modern departments. It has very old school labels. And so that's where we're like, well, let's start with what we think the data should look like that would give us the insights that we think would be useful. And so our data comes from a combination of us scraping the internet and looking at like hundreds of
Right.
companies and trying to see if they have
Yep.
data, and then fitting it into our standard, as well as companies that have decided to use our data standard to submit data to us directly. And I think for companies that are starting to think about the broad topic of transparency, especially around DEIB, the question becomes like, is this something you want your company to commit to? Because what we've also seen is individuals who sit in certain talent, HR, or DEI seats that are interested in this to begin with, if they leave, that initiative often leaves with them. And so I think at a company level, especially in the C-suite, the decision needs to be made whether transparency on DEIB is something they care about, number one, and how they want to go about that. Because some companies are like, oh, we publish it in our own format on our website.
Yeah.
We don't want to use your standard. We're like, cool, we'll just pull the data from your website then, right? But I think it really comes down to a values alignment of, does being transparent in general about where your company is going and how you want to operate as a company align with sharing your data? Because it is about sharing your data for me, but collectively in terms of the DIB conversation, I think it's a much larger one around, where does your company want to go? And I'll use HP as an example, as the last thing I'll say on this for the moment.
Mhm.
HP, we've talked to their teams. They have said their broad mission as a company is to be the most just tech company in the industry, right? And so for a company to set that as their DEIB mission, then they can build off of that at each department, each level, each kind of type of engagement around the topic of DEIB. But that's come from the executive level, and then it's been able to trickle down into the organization, and then everybody has to figure out how they're going to live into that. That's a very different approach than someone being like, oh shit, we have to focus on DEIB, like someone take care of this, and then someone's going to take care
Exactly.
of it, and they find tactical things to do. And for a moment, it might be sharing data, but if that person leaves, then the next person might decide it's not sharing data.
God, I don't think 30 minutes is not enough for these.
um,
Kira
should we
asked,
touch on these questions, or should we?
yeah, let's do these. These are just like, because people are getting in, let's do it.
Okay, awesome. So I'll go. So Kira asked about generational data. So I'm taking this in
Yes.
terms of age, whether this data correlates generationally. So this is part of our strategy. We didn't ask for age last year, but we are asking for age this year. And the reason being, no company has to share any data if they don't want to. Right now, there's no legal mandate. There's no, 2020 was public pressure. But once public pressure goes away, once the PR pressure goes away, no one has to share this data. And so our thought was, okay, we're trying to ask companies to do something that's scary for them, that they might be unwilling to do, that they don't have to do. How do we get, if our goal is just to get more data to start, how do we get more companies to share? So last year for identifiers, we focused on what the EEOC already uses, just to make it easier to be like, okay, this is not that different. We're doing something you're already sharing. We're just asking you to do it in a public sphere. And we did ask more detail around, like I said, retention and attrition and department level data. But we thought it was just kind of like a nice bridge to something a little bit more detailed. And this year we've added age. We've added, for the general population though, we've added age, we've added veteran status, ability, LGBTQIA orientation, as well as kind of neurodiversity. And so our thought is like, how can we each year increase kind of the level of detail we're asking for? And I know that's not perfect or ideal,
Yeah.
but the data we're asking for is already in like the 100+ data point level. And so to ask, basically, if we ask any other additional identifier, it multiplies that by an additional, identifier. And so we were trying to be mindful of how do we keep people engaged so that we can build enough traction to ask for like the full slew of data that we want.
So Christina asks, on a high level, how are you compiling this data to find out where the diversity exists and how it reflects in the org as helping them potentially excel?
Okay, so okay, I think I've understood this question. So Christina, I apologize if I don't fully answer the question. The way that we've defined level, and I'm thinking about excelling and progression in terms of, level and title. We didn't want to center it around title because every company has such different titling process, like titling structures. And so we thought about it in terms of influence and power. And so individual contributor is the professional where you're not managing anybody. Management is you have direct reports. Senior/executive is you are overseeing a department or a discipline or an entire office, like you're the MD of the New York office, for example. And then C-suite officers where you have influence over the entire company. And so what we didn't want to get caught in is like director, senior director, like VP, EVP. And so because sometimes a VP, for example, in banking means actually it means middle management, right? So it doesn't reflect across all industries and all companies. So we focus it around power. And so it's only 4 levels that we're looking at. Where we are pointing to what we've seen, for example, within the advertising industry, is the biggest drop off for women for every non-white racial group happens between that first jump. And so we're centering a lot of our conversations with individual companies more around what are you doing to change this? Right? What are you doing to ensure that more make it into middle management? Because by the time you're considering who goes into senior management and the executive level, you're already picking from a smaller pool, right? They're like, well, we can't just take someone off, we can't take someone from the junior levels and move them into this level. And if the diverse talent, quote, quote, doesn't exist, then we can't hire them, right? So it's like, let's make sure they exist, right? Let's make sure they're getting into the middle management layer so that they have the opportunity to be considered. And so we're able to point to more specific areas. 10 years ago, an example, we were seeing that at a couple of companies, white talent both had the longest tenure and longest and highest attrition. So that seemed to indicate they had both opportunities to lead and stay, whereas we were seeing that attrition tenure for other groups were very low. So it's like, what are you doing to ensure that these groups are staying within your organization past 2 years, right? So we can start to point to, okay, in the 1 to 2 year mark, something is happening within this group and that they're considering leaving. They don't feel like they belong there. They don't feel like they have opportunities. So with that, we're able to point to more specific things. So Christina, I hope that starts to address kind of what you're asking about.
So we have a couple of minutes left, and there are still some questions. We're not going to be able to get to all, but what I want to do is I want to wrap up with Amanda's question. This is like no pressure, Pam, but we're going to try to answer or like comment on Amanda's question, and then just overall just wrap it up on what to say to companies who are afraid of this data as well. But like for Christina, or excuse me, Amanda is interested on how to track the neurodiversity and disability without evading the privacy of employees.
Yeah, totally.
Great
So
question.
I think for each individual company, there has to be a decision around why you would collect certain data and to communicate that very clearly to your employees. What I've heard from many HR people is that, or talent representatives, is that many people are asking for this data within their organization, right? So people who are from the LGBTQIA community, people who are in the trans community, people who are, of a certain background are like, why don't you have data on our group? How many people or what % of the company is blank, right? So some of it is coming from internal forces that are driving the conversation. But I think for a company that is maybe might not be experiencing those internal forces, I think the question becomes like, who are you trying, what do you want to understand about your organization? And all of this information is voluntary. Technically, no one has to answer the gender question or the race question in onboarding forms.
Right.
If you don't do it though, unfortunately, the EEOC requires companies over 100 people that have to submit this form to them. They require HR to fill it in. So if you have 300 employees, they expect 300 data points on gender and race. So what's really unfortunate is that HR departments have to basically choose for someone, which sucks. It's a responsibility. But that's how the EEOC works, because they require the numbers to match. So, but technically from the employee side, they don't have to answer any of these questions. So I think making it very clear that it's optional, it's entirely voluntary, and the reason, and be very explicit about your why, which is true of any business objective, right? Like, why are we doing this? We're doing this because we want to make sure that we understand our employee population and the makeup. We want to make sure that by understanding that makeup, we're providing kind of the services and, being thoughtful about how we're going about maybe evaluation, for example, neurodiverse people, right? Or ability. And so the more you can understand about your populace, the more you can serve them, and then you have to actually serve them, right? So right. I think in terms of just the data collection, though, I think it's no different than any new initiative. It's being very clear about why you're doing it, being very clear about how it impacts employees, and then especially for sensitive data and private data, be very clear that it's entirely optional and none of it will be held against them, right? And so some of these additional things like ability, people do in a survey that's anonymized. Right, so there are different ways to try and find this data and keep it private. I know we're out of time.
Pam Yang, let's go. You are amazing. Thank you so much for your knowledge. And like, I know Hunter's like, Lucy, we're wrapping things up, but really quickly, where can we find you? And just one more time, your plug for your nonprofit.
Okay, awesome. So I've shared my LinkedIn, and then I'll share our website for agency DEI. And the last thing I'll land on, which actually really neatly answers Jacqueline's question, is as a starting point for systemic and structural and operational change, I do think it starts with the data. Even if you don't share it publicly, look at your internal data to see where the problems are, where people are dropping off, where people aren't progressing, because then you can look at what's happening in those specific instances to think about what needs to change in your maybe your annual reviews, your leveling, your job descriptions, all of those things. I think it starts with understanding what problems you need to address, and that starts with the data. So for each company, I hope they start to assess it in that way.
Thank you so much, Pam. This was amazing. Sorry, Hunter. And sorry for Lex that's about to come on, who's amazing as well. Y'all are amazing. I want to be on here forever, but I've got to go. And thank you so much again. And thank you all for watching.